Okay, so tonight we're going to do the first one of our sort of Christmas/winter themed doodles. I'm just going to try and adjust the lighting. It's very difficult in the winter to get the lighting just right. But so what I've got here is a piece of A4 paper. I've got a watercolour paper which has a very slight texture. It's not very textured, but it's just got, I just like a stiffer paper when I'm doing doodling. And I'm going to be using just ordinary black drawing pens. At the moment, these are my favourite ones. They're by Pigma Micron pens. They do a nice range, but I mean, as I've often said before, to be honest, my favourite one tends to be what's ever on sale and is the best value at the time, because they pretty much all do the same job. For this piece, and we're going to do a piece based on sort of like doodle fir trees, as if we're drawing like a kind of Christmas forest, you know, of pine trees, because I always think that they are so iconic as winter trees, and that lovely sort of shape is really fun to play with. What we're going to do first of all is to actually create a little frame that we're going to work into. Often I find that when we're doing pieces like this, a frame gives you like a space you can work to, and it makes it slightly less daunting than saying I'm going to fill the entire page. To create the frame, what I've got here is a smaller, this is an A4 piece of paper, so I've got an A5 piece of paper here. Now you do not have to have a piece of paper to hand. You can just freehand kind of mark yourself off a border, but you may well have a piece of paper that you can draw around, which is quite handy. You don't need to, if you haven't got a, you can use a ruler, you can use anything. You don't have any shape or size frame you want, but I'm just going to draw around this A5 piece of paper on my A4 piece of paper, so that should give me a frame in the page to work to. So I'd like to add a decorated frame to this, with the idea again that you might want to make this into a Christmas card in some way. Now I don't mind at all hand-drawn lines. I think slightly wobbly lines are really quite attractive, and they have that kind of lovely hand-drawn feel. If you haven't got a card, obviously you could use a ruler. You know, you can just about see the line there. I'm sorry, so it's quite difficult to see the line. When we go into pen, it will be a lot easier to see, because I can see it fine here. The camera can't see it quite as well as I can, but you can just see there's the frame at the top there, just sort of going round. So I'm just leaving me a little white border. So as I said, don't mind hand-drawn wobbly lines at all. I think they're quite charming. So what we're going to do is, once you've got your, this is the outer frame, the pencil line that I've drawn here, I'm going to then hand draw a frame inside that. I suppose roughly, I mean, I could measure it, but I'm sort of going for 1.5 centimetres, or in old money, I suppose about 1/2 inch or so, just to draw so that I've got a nice frame. But again, I don't mind it being hand-drawn, because this is a hand-drawn piece. I want to have that hand-drawn feel. If it goes a little bit wibbly-wobbly, I think that's nice. And if you end up going wrong, you can always grab a rubber and change it, you know. If you've got something to draw around, if you want to do a really straight frame, please do. If you've got a ruler or a pencil that's long enough to kind of draw around. I'm going to very quickly draw this in pen, or, you know, probably just a regular speed, draw it in pen, mainly because it's going to make it much easier for you to see what I'm doing. And eventually we are going to want to do it in pen, but I'm going to do it quite quickly so you can see where I am, hopefully. And oh, I managed to pick up one pen not in my set that is slightly running out, but it doesn't matter because we can do it a bit later. So they can see that's the shape, and I'd say I really like that sort of slightly hand-drawn cartoon feel. And I think when you don't quite know where you're going, or you just want to sit down and do a doodle, there is something very satisfying about drawing a frame to work into. I always feel it's weirdly successful to do that. I'm just changing pens because that one's a bit dry. Here we go, that's better. So I'm doing both of them so we can kind of see where we are. And again, you can see it's definitely not straight, and I like that feel. And I think when you've got the textured paper as well, it tends to slightly throw your pen off in a wobble, and I quite like that. And you can choose to round the corners or keep them square, however you feel is going to work for you. But I quite like that sort of, I love this cartoon kind of hand-drawn feel. So I want to make this look a bit like a little pop-up theatre, I suppose, almost. I want to get a sense of depth into the images that we're going to draw. So even though they're going to start as flat doodles, we're going to try and get some shadow into them and make them look quite attractive. And of course, eventually we could got this lovely frame now, which we can get doodle pattern into. We're going to try and get a little bit of 3D quality into that frame. So we're going to start by kind of determining, as it were, almost like the trunks of our trees. I'm going to do a couple of sort of like spines, I suppose, to start off with. So this is just going to determine the length of my tree on the right. So I'm just literally going to do a line going down. And what you've got to think about is the one that you do here. These are your trees that are going to be in the front. So as you go behind, we'll do the ones in front first, then we'll do ones going further back to give a nice sense of depth. So I've got one spine on this side and one on this side. Try to do them slightly different lengths, or heights rather. And again, they're not straight, they can be a slight wobble. We're going to put the two trees in here first, then we're going to go for a tree in between. But the left and right tree are going to be sort of the closest to the camera, just to create that sort of overlapping. I did all that in a 0.8 pen, but I'm going to swap to a slightly lighter pen, so around about a 0.3 or 0.4. I mean, you can have any point really, but so that sort of end of things. Don't go too tiny yet. We'll come back to that later. So we're going to start with this is going to become a tree here. Now, to get the kind of excuse me, pine tree, Christmas tree kind of effect, we want to have a gradation in size. So the biggest shapes are going to be at the bottom, and we're going to go up to the smallest shapes at the top to give us that kind of triangular form. If you're not confident about doing a nice sort of perfect triangle, and you don't have to be, you can get a straight edge and just give yourself like a sort of in pencil a kind of outline to work to. So we'll do this on this first one, and then as you grow in confidence you might not need one. So I'm going to use again the piece of card that I had like a ruler, and you can see I'm just going to put in a guideline on each side to represent my triangles. Obviously the trees are inside the frame, so if you hit the frame, just stop your line there. So you can just ghostly see that kind of frame there for my tree, and I can always erase it later, so it doesn't really matter that it's there. Right, so this is going to give us a place to start. So I'm going to start off by doing a long sort of curly spiral that's going to come out for the bottom, and when it hits that guideline it's going to come round into a nice snaily spiral like that. So I've got my first, we're going to add to it, but we're going to start now on this side. Because my frame disappears off, my curly spiral has got to disappear off, so it's going to go as far as it can towards the edge. And then when you hit the edge, what I do is I lift my pen up and then I mime drawing that shape. And the moment I hit back onto the zone, as it were, I put my pen down again, lift it up and then put it down. And that just allows you to draw that spiral as if it was tucked in behind the frame. So we're going to move up the tree and we're going to draw these sort of curly spirals all the way up. And slowly as we go up, we need to get them slightly smaller each time. Now, luckily, trees are not perfectly symmetrical things, and neither are doodle trees. So we can, just as long as we've got a rough sort of rhythm going uphill, we're going to be fine. We're going to get that kind of feeling in. Doesn't have to be perfect. So as we go up, but having that guideline is really quite helpful just to get the sort of the heads of those spirals to touch in the right kind of area. Even if you go above it, out of line slightly, it doesn't really matter, because you're working with something that's mimicking a natural form. We're not going for perfect geometry. I've got a gap there. I don't mind that. If we get a gap, we can work with it, because again, branches not being perfect. So as we come up, it works quite well if we slowly make the gap, as it were, between the sort of spiral roots. If that comes slightly closer together each time, then that sort of makes our spirals get a little bit smaller each time as we go up. And we're going to creep up towards the top. Eventually we're going to fill this in a bit more so there's not so much white space, and give it a bit more depth. But we're just going to get these spirals going up and up. And as that distance gets shorter from the spine out to the guideline, the spirals will naturally get shorter and smaller, and you'll get that nice, quite iconic sort of gradiated feel. So here we go. And of course they get shorter as well. And I think the spiral should probably get slightly less spirally. And as we come up to the top, we've got to think, how are we going to fit those in? They're just going to come little snail spirals without hardly any stem all the way up to the top. And then they're going to get really small, absolutely tiddly tiny. And there we go. And at the top, they're just going to be almost just little circles, really. Just 2 little circles at the top. Right, so there we go. So hopefully that's given us that nice sort of gradiated feel. And there is always something very satisfying about things. It's a bit like those Romanesque cauliflowers. Have you ever seen those that look far too beautiful to eat? And you know, don't taste as beautiful as they look. Well, they taste all right, but it just tastes like ordinary cauliflower. But there's something like a beautiful like pattern going up. So we're going to do a similar pattern on this side, but we're going to vary it. So again, you might want to put in some guidelines. We're going to come back and add to these. They're not going to just be as spindly as this. We're going to add to them a bit. With this guideline, because I've got a slightly sort of wobbly, more of a wobbly trunk on this side, I'm going to sketch in my guideline by hand. I've picked up the wrong pencil, this one doesn't work, here it is. So that I want to follow that slight wobble. So I'm going to come down from the point and wobble it out on one side and then wobble it in on the other side like that, just so that I've got a slightly different shape. You can just about see it on that side. It's being whited out a bit by the light from the computer screen. Right, so these ones, I'm going to do like a long teardrop shape. So it's going to come out and then the round end's going to hit the guideline and it's going to fold back in. So it is basically a teardrop, but it's just a very elongated one. And with these, we're going to have a little bit of overlap happening. So you slightly tuck them into the one below like that, so they're kind of disappearing off behind. I always think these teardrop shapes are endlessly satisfying to draw. There's something, I don't know why, but they remind me of whales. They remind me of like, you know, a pod of whales in the sea. They're not going to look like whales, but there's just something about that round forehead shape. And you can see they're quite, at the moment, they're different. You know, they're not symmetrical. You've got one side coming out smaller than the other, and I don't mind that at all. I think that looks fine for what we're working to. You may need to put, like, instead of doing backwards and forwards one at a time, you might need to put a few extra in on one side, because if you've got a difference in size, you might find that they develop differently. Well, that doesn't matter. But it's got that nice sort of like, almost like a feather kind of feel coming up the side. And we're going to add detail to this and get them to really pop off the page. And as they come up, obviously you're going to lose a lot of the tail. They're going to just become curved round shapes, sort of half like leaf shapes coming up. Here we go, getting a bit smaller. And again, they're going to disappear up towards the top. And as they come up, they're almost just going to become little tiny leaf shapes or drop shapes. Up we come until at the very top you might just have 2 little tiny ones. There we go. So now we've got 2 sort of shapes coming in. And I think it is quite noticeable how all these sort of organic shapes have these at the moment. They could be fern fronds, they could be all sorts of plant bits, but it's, you know, nature, when something works, that nature goes with it and it makes it sort of, you know, build up. And this sort of form is so current in all sorts of plants and growing things. Right, so now I'm going to do the middle one. The middle one we're going to do slightly differently. It's not going to have a central spine in quite the same way, but I think we're still going to give ourselves a guideline to kind of follow. So this time we're just going to draw in, I picked up the wrong pencil again. I should really put this pencil out of reach. Here we go. It's better. We're going to do a guideline that's just the triangle without the sort of spine going through it. So, because we're going to fill it with in a slightly different way to these ones, just so that it stands out. And don't forget, it's going behind these ones. So if you hit their edges, then they're going to go behind. So to do this one, we're going to start the other way around. We're going to start at the top rather than at the bottom, because we want them to kind of overlap. And I think it's going to be easier to draw them this way. So you might want to watch how I draw this shape and then see how I progress, and then we'll catch it up. So at the very top here, I'm going to use small teardrop shapes now. So, but they're going to be upside down, as it were, compared to these ones. So I'm going to put in, I have to move my hand so it's not blocking. I hope you can see all right. Almost like a little bunch of teardrop bananas. So at the top there, you've got 3 little teardrops like that. Just sort of a moment they appear to be floating in space. And then we're going to imagine there's all these bunches of like teardrop bananas, but the ends are going to be tucked in underneath the sort of bunch above. So what you're going to see here is the ends of the teardrop bunch of bananas kind of sticking out, but you're not going to see the top again. So you see it's 3 little sort of like petals, sort of like a sort of very layered up daisy. I mean, you could do them as individual daisy bumps, it's not really a problem, but if you kind of imagine that they're coming together in a bunch as they come down, so you're seeing those sort of shapes, almost like a clamshell shape. If you're not sure, if you imagine, if you want to draw with your pencil, you could draw a shape a bit like a long triangle. Can we see that sort of shape just about there in pencil? Imagine that the end is tucked in behind the ones above, sort of like that, following your shape down, and then you can fit your teardrops into that sort of pencil triangle, so they're kind of all slightly in bunches together. And I think if you can get this to work, it works quite well because it's slightly reminiscent of the way pine trees sort of have their branches in kind of bunches, and sort of on the ends of branches they have sort of bunches of pine needles on the end of branches. They're not actually solid cones. You can see how we're starting to get that kind of overlapping feel coming down. Think of them almost like sort of seashells or sort of something kind of fitting in together, a bit like that. And as they come down, they're going to get slightly bigger. So you might want to just do like bunches of 4 coming in, and then you might do a couple sticking out at the side. And I can put another bunch in here. We're going to add some shading to these in a bit to give them a bit more sort of 3D quality. These don't have to vary too much in size as they come down. I think if they're slightly bigger towards the bottom, that's going to help because it's going to give them a bit more visual weight. And I think it'll help to emphasise that tree feel. I mean, you can do any, if you develop a pattern when you're doing this that's different and you like it, please go for it. Please don't feel you have to do exactly my patterns at all. It never matters at the end of the day if they're exactly the same as mine or not, because they will all work out. But I think try and use this nice rounded shape in some way, and this idea of things overlapping. So we can, I'm going off piece here, I'm kind of doing like a spiral, I'm quite enjoying that. Get this feeling of the bits overlapping, because then we've got a nice thing we can add some text, some tone to kind of bring that out a bit. And I think being able to add a bit of tone into the proceedings really helps to bring them alive. So I'm just coming around, I'm going to do another bunch here because I'm getting carried away and doing twisty spirals of them, and that's a bit complicated. So let's do some more bunches, and as they come down they're going to get slightly larger, but I hope we're starting to get something with quite a nice texture and a nice kind of feel. And it's surprising, such an iconic shape, the pine tree shape, that even though these really bear no relationship to natural trees at all, everyone will go, oh look, you've got 3 Christmas trees there. I mean, it's great, isn't it? And card manufacturers and illustrators all over the shop use all sorts of very obscure triangles, and we all go, yes, that's a Christmas tree. And one year we built our Christmas tree out of a spiral of copper pipes, which sounds ridiculous, but actually it was really quite good fun. It was the steampunk Christmas tree. It worked really well, but it was just because it was that triangle, that cone-like shape, seemed to, everyone immediately knew it was a Christmas tree, and it was covered in Christmas tree lights, and it was Christmas, so that's always a dead giveaway, I suppose. Right, so we're going to bring these last sort of bits coming down, and remember this tree is behind the 2 in front, so if you hit the edge of one of the other trees, then they sort of take precedence, as it were. So you're going to sort of stop your bumpy banana design and tuck it in behind the ones in front. I was thinking a bit like, you know, driving along and you hit a give way sign. You've got to decide who has priority on this journey, and it's definitely the 2 in front. It'll help to give us a bit of perspective. So there we go. So those are getting a bit bigger now because we're getting further down. So I hit a spiral there so I can stop my bump. And again here, where it hits that larger teardrop shape, they're just going to disappear behind that. But we're going to keep organising that into groups, sort of like half daisies coming round and moving on down. And then towards the bottom, these can get a little bit bigger, but they should still have lots of nice You should get a nice sort of difference between the two surfaces. Don't get them so big that they look like the teardrops on the left-hand side one. I want to try and still imagine them being in kind of hands, but as they sort of touch the one on each side, you're gonna just disappear the bits that are tucking in behind the trees that are sitting next to them. So these are the most full trees, as it were, because the rest we're going to see as points sticking up behind these ones to kind of increase that sense of depth and forestness. So the next ones that we're going to do, we're just going to do as the tops and the points, and then we're going to use smaller shapes as well so that they start to disappear, because obviously as things move away from us perspective wise, they appear to get smaller, don't they? There is a classic episode of Father Ted which I often quote when doing drawing classes, where Ted is in a caravan trying to explain to Dougal about perspective, and he's got a toy cow like from a farm in one hand, and he sort of says, "This one is small," and he points out the window and says, "Those ones are far away," and Dougal sort of obviously stares blankly at him and doesn't get it. But it's a bit like that. It's actually a very good way of explaining perspective, that the smaller you make things, the further away they appear. So when we come to the sort of tops of the trees behind, we're going to use fairly small patterns. And there we go. And that bit of me talking about Father Ted has really led up to me finishing all of that tree in. So we've got those sort of first 3 trees coming in. And then we're now going to say we're going to do the sort of trees that come in behind. Again, you might want to do a pencil margin to follow, but that's going to come down, it's going to disappear off in between those trees that you've got there. I know it's very faint on my one, so you can't really see it, but I've got 2 sort of like trees and then one sort of sticking up behind here, but these are all going to be smaller because they're going to be further away, and they're going to be tucked behind these trees in front. So for this one here, I'm going to do, again, a guideline of 2 triangles, and we're going to fill it up, I'm going to fill this one up with just a sort of circular pattern. So I'm going to start again at the top because I'm going to see the most of that. So small circles kind of clustering together, and as they come down they might get a tiny bit bigger, but mostly I'm going to put larger ones on that line that I've ruled, or I haven't ruled it, but I've drawn it. I'm going to do the larger size ones, so I suppose about sort of 0.5 centimetre sort of size coming down, and then when I hit the tree they're going to just disappear in behind that one. You see that disappearing down there, and there we go, that's sort of gone all the way down there, and then I'm going to fill in that a bit more with some small, and as I go down, these ones that I'm going to put on next are going to be slightly smaller. So it's almost like a sort of snake skin effect, I suppose. And some of them can overlap. They don't have to all be honeycombed, and then they disappear off, and then this side again a little bit smaller. And I can just fill in the top of that tree, and as long as I keep to that outline, then it's going to fill nicely down. And I've got sort of medium-sized ones, and there's a few gaps, it doesn't matter. You can either overlap them or you can have gaps. You can have a mixture of both. Absolutely fine. And as we come down, again, just remember that the ones in front are in front. So the moment you hit one of those with your pen, you just stop it, and you don't sort of crash over like that. And then I'm just going to keep on filling that down until it's all filled in with circles. And we're going to give it a different kind of treatment, so eventually it will stand out a lot more than the others. You'll see the difference between them because we're going to add some shadow and shade. Here we go, and just fill in those last bits on this side and then just down this side. It almost looks a bit like a baby corn, doesn't it? Like when you get in the stir fries. I always think they look like yellow trees. Let's just get those last circles in. And of course they're a smaller shape as well. It's this old thing that I say boringly and relentlessly, but when you want to make something darker in pen work, you do smaller shapes, because the smaller shapes, there's more pen on the surface and less paper visible. So it generally makes the whole thing look darker. So then we've got this sort of one here. So I'm going to do a similar kind of idea to this one, I suppose. They're never going to be identical, but a sort of vaguely similar kind of idea. But just imagine that you've got some And I'm going to work small again down to big this time, because we're just fitting it into this little shape here. So we're going to put just maybe some teardrop shapes, but we're going to put a different pattern into them so they will stand out. But this one, oh, that's quite interesting. Look, I'm just discovering this. You can kind of not quite join them up, look, and it does it sort of looks like a kind of heart shape kind of coming down. That's quite fun, isn't it? Let's see if I can get that to work all the way down. So look, I don't match them up. That's how you do it. So each time I'm going a little bit lower on the stem, but still remembering when I hit that tree, they're going to tuck in behind and they're going to be out of sight. Here we go, and let's just get those last couple in. So we're just going to see a little bit of those. Not so much to draw in. There we go. So that's that one kind of poking in there. And then we've got this one here. So I think we're doing sort of quite curly trees, aren't we? So I want to stick to a kind of curly shape. So I'm going to do a circle at the top, and then I'm going to bring some teardrop shapes kind of coming up and around, but maybe crossing some of the tails over. So they're slightly in the front, but still following that sort of form of the tree again. And we can put different surface patterns on them, and they're going to get a different look quite soon. So we've got nearly them all in, and remember they're going to disappear behind the frame as well, because this one's at the edge of the picture. So when they hit that frame, that's going to move across like that, and then we're just seeing the little bits of it that are still visible behind. And the shape has slightly changed. I've been going down. I don't mind that. I think it's quite nice sometimes. But obviously its central stem is kind of going off that way, so let's bring that down there. So we've got those sort of in, and there's probably room. We could put another one kind of in here, and maybe on this one we're only going to see like half a kind of thing coming through, but we'll come back to that one. And of course you could go back even further, so you can have one little tiny one kind of at the back there, and we'll give it and this time I'm going to use a really small shape, just little tiny shape in rows coming down. So I've got a little sort of, where they've done that line there, I'm coming down in tiny shapes. I'm going to then come down and fatten it out to make it more like a cone shape. So at the moment it looks like a sort of frond, but I'm using a tiny shape so that it's darker. And as I was saying just now, they look darker, the shape looks smaller, so everything hopefully looks further away. There we go. So comes down, fits in between. There we go. And I'm just going to fill in a little bit of the gaps, but it just should look like a sort of point far off in the distance in our kind of forest. Right, so I've got those in. Of course, you can always add more in further back, but I'm going to come back, and I want to do some slightly more detail on some of these shapes here. So with these sort of curls here, I want to come in sort of in between and draw a slight sort of neck coming in on some of these, and I'm going to come in between and get some dark lines into that to kind of exaggerate that shape. So I'm just making them, I suppose, stand out a bit more, kind of more like individual branches as they come down, coming down from the middle of each sort of spiral into where they're coming out from the stem, the trunk, that's the word, the tree stem. And again, same here, just coming back down that way. I think it's always a good idea when you're working on the trees being a sort of single piece, I suppose, isn't it? Or it's one thing. Do each stage on each part of it before you move on to the next stage, because otherwise, if you're like me, you then tend to forget halfway up what you've done, and you're not going to get that even rhythm kind of coming through. And then once I've got that, I'm going to add some circles, I think, just to add some decoration. So larger circle, medium circle and small circle, like that, sort of in a 3. It's always a good idea with design, if you're sort of doing something quite obvious like this, to go for odd numbers. I think it's always more satisfying for some reason. I think the problem is if you have 2 of things, it just always starts to look a bit like 2 eyeballs, you know, sort of 2 googly eyes looking at you. So I think it's always good to have odd numbers. And again, we're using that sort of gradation in size, so we're going from large to medium to small as we go down, and that helps to get that feeling of things growing because they're sort of growing out that way towards the spiral. Here we go. And as they come up, of course, the biggest circle you're doing is going to be getting smaller and smaller until it's just going to be little tiny circles. And if you can't fit 3 in, then you can go down to 2 and just try and squeeze them in as long as you can until eventually they're going to become like little dots kind of going up. Oh, there we go. And maybe at the top just single ones like that because they've got so sort of dense and we can't see them too much. Right, okay, so now I've done that one, so I'm going to then put some decoration into this one. So this one again, just with these teardrops, just very simple, long line coming out in the middle and then curl it back on itself, so you've got like a nice sort of centre piece, sort of like that, like a sort of like a vein or something on a leaf, but just so it's repeating that shape, and just try and follow the shape and the curve of the teardrop shape you've got coming out. Here we go, just sort of flinging it over the top like that. And sometimes they may be covered by the ones below, and that's fine as long as you remember the rule of which ones are in front and which ones behind. And if you've got some close cut lids, you can just do a very long thin line and then open it out and then just bring it back down the same route, and it's sort of going to start giving that nice pattern. Obviously there is like loads of different patterns you can choose to do in here, and you can get as complicated as you like. You don't have to stick to these. So here we go, just moving up. And again, naturally, as your shapes are going to get smaller, then your interior bits are going to get smaller as well. So it's going to sort of keep just enhancing that kind of growth feel, or that conical shape. The conical conifer. I'm going to keep coming up again until we disappear, and these inside shapes are going to disappear and get as small as possible to fit into the outside shape. Here we go. Up to the top, there we go. So that's all of those sort of in there. And then this one, I'm going to leave this one at the moment because I'm going to add some shading to this one. But let's look at this one here. I'm just going to do some lines that mimic the ones in front. If I do it on this one that's more visible, then it might be easier to see before I do the ones that are disappearing off behind. Again, any kind of shape you like, just to follow the outer shape, just echoing it and maybe putting, and if you run out of space like to get a half moon, you can just put a little line in. It's just trying to make these stand out so they're still slightly different from each other. It doesn't have to be exactly the same each time round. Let's put this in. So down here, again, just watch where you've got the overlap, that again you stop and then join it up again underneath, and that just always makes it look like, it makes it easy to see which one's in front and which one's behind. And it's that helps to kind of give it that sense of reality. There we go. And again on this side, just coming down and just very small at the top and larger as we go down. And if you just try and mimic the shape that you've got and then just repeat it getting smaller and smaller, it's got that nice slightly rainbow, slightly psychedelic feel. And again, as you come up, you hit the one in front and just stop your line, and that just helps place it, it grounds it, it gives it that kind of feeling of perspective and depth. So there we go, so that's got all of that one in. So we're starting to get some more detail coming in, more bang for our buck. Right, so we've got this tree here on the side, this one here. So we want to put something, shapes going in here. That little, the circle at top of mine, so I'm going to turn that into a spiral. And then I think we'll put a little spiral into each one. So a bit like these, but yet different. So tight spiral at the end and then bring a line down. So if I try and get a nice tight spiral into that bump, and then as if it's unwinding and then shooting down into that central stem trunk again, calling it a stem, I can't get that out of my head now. It's not as bad as my favourite phrase I always come out with, which is drawing a round circle. I'm relentlessly telling people to draw round circles. And again, as they hit the edge, they're just gonna see like a sort of cut across version of that spiral. And then up on this side, round and round. Here we go. And just following that shape and filling it in, so we've got that nice slightly spindly feel. And of course, as we're getting more pen work in, again, it's sort of making that stand out, and keeping into that rhythm that we've established really helps making it look like it's growing, even if it's the most surreal Christmas tree out there, or surreal pine tree. I suppose they're only a Christmas tree if you cut them down in December, I think. So I'm going to overlap those bits in there. There we go. So that's starting to get those together. Now I'm going to come back with some darker pen. I think I do need to put something in this edge here, but I'll do this towards the end because, you know, I want you to see how the sort of the shading on this can develop, so that you can sort of see the difference between them. So I'm going to use a slightly heavier pen. If you've got one, a brush pen works really well for this, because you can kind of brush it into the corners of what you're working on. I'm just trying to... I've got another set of pens which got a lovely brush pen, but they're sort of like the word brush is indented into the top, and it's actually quite hard to see because it's sort of like, you know, it's like having a black words on a black sign, which is not so clear. So where I've got these nice thin triangular shapes between the trees, I'm going to start shading that in now. So that's going to add some bold depth to the pattern. Just bringing those in here. I think I've got a slightly thicker pen that I might do it in, just because I'm trying to work at speed. I'm going to do mine relatively quickly. If you don't get all yours done on yours during the session, you can always go back and sort of tidy it up later. But you can see how that's starting to give that really quite nice depth. And I think looking at it, I'm going to colour some of my circles in dark as well. I think that will, I mean, some of them, I'm going to do all of them. So that will kind of make this nice and bold and make it kind of stand out a bit more on what I'm doing. I just want to find more of a brush pen, because I'll be quicker with a brush pen. Here it is. That's the one I want. So I'm going to whiz through and sort of get all these in as neatly as I can, but also at speed, just so that we can get that, see what we're aiming for. Whoops. So if mine might change shape rapidly because as I go a bit wobbly, but again, nobody knows when they're looking at it what it was meant to be, so we can live with all of these slight imperfections. And obviously, if you're not doing it in a class for other people to watch, you can take your time and redraw them. And I'm just going to come, just going to draw in between those shapes and get some sort of like shadow in. And it's so lovely to see that contrast coming, and it really makes this sort of pop out and starts to define those nice sort of almost like peacock feather shapes. I've also had this idea about making a Christmas tree out of lovely feathers, which probably isn't very vegan, but we did go to a garden centre once, and I saw someone had made this beautiful enormous tree, like a sort of Christmas tree out of giant pink ostrich feathers. And I did quite fancy it, and I thought, well, I'll go and see how much it is, you know, and it was £4,000, so we didn't buy that. Funnily enough, we didn't buy that one, but it did look rather nice, and I thought it didn't seem very fair on the ostriches, so yeah, so I'm just colouring those in darker as well as we go. Now that starts to really sort of pop out. Now, of course, we're using just like monochrome black on white here, which I think is really effective, but you could also think about doing this in colours. You could use shades of green would be the obvious choice, but if you get, and we will be at some point in the series using some gold and silver pens, because what is Christmas doodling without gold and silver pens, I ask you? So doing this in gold and silver on a black card or a dark green card, that would be fantastically effective, I think. It'd be different. It has its own kind of appeal, the monochrome. So that's what we're doing tonight. But you can see how there's loads of room to get quite creative with it. So I'm just going to put those last ones in. I love this brush pen. It's a very soft brush pen, but it's that slight variability, which means it's a little bit harder to draw it and talk at the same time. It's one of those ones where it's a bit like walking and chewing gum. On some days that's quite an effort. But we're just going there, right? So it's just sort of so you can see you can't go quite all the way to the top, but even when you get up to the top sort of fronds, you might want to just come with just a fractionally heavier pen, just to continue that line kind of coming down. So this is starting to look really smart now, but we've not finished there, because I want to still get a little bit of shade in round the sort of the noses. I always think of them as noses of these sort of spiral shapes. So I mentioned before, I found a brown pencil, which may not be the obvious choice for Christmas, but I kind of want to give this a slightly old school sepia kind of feel as well. So I'm just going to do a very light bit of pencil shading just up to, can you see just around that sort of spiral, to help that kind of overlap feel. Now you can use an ordinary lead pencil, you could use a black colour pencil if you want to stick strictly to the monochrome theme. You could use a dark green pencil. You could use any pencil you've got to hand really, but I'm changing to pencil so I can get that slight softness into the shading. So I just want to put a little bit of shade in sort of underneath, and particularly around that kind of curly nose of each spiral. And as you come down to where you're getting an overlap, if anything's overlapping, you can kind of shade down to that as well. And you might take a little bit shading down towards the trunk and the central spine, because that helps again to give this a kind of pop and a kind of art. Now, if you really get into doing things, or you really think, I want to really push that kind of old sepia kind of feel, you might have done this at school years ago, but one of the best ways of making your paper look kind of old and sepia is to paint it, dab an old tea bag over the top, and the tannin will give you a super kind of weathered ancient paper kind of feel once it's dry. So that's quite a good thing. There's nothing to say you can't sort of start by priming your paper with a bit of tea bag to give it that kind of aged feel before you start. So I'm just putting in a bit of shade. So hopefully we're seeing that's just starting to give that. It's really making these kind of the white spirals at the top kind of pop out. Now you can spend a lot of time shading, and it's great fun. I'm obviously moving a little bit quickly because I don't want us to get a good idea of where we're going with this before the end of the session. It's surprising how our time gets eaten up when we're doing the sessions, how it flies by without us noticing almost. So, but I think it's really worth spending some time and blending that shadow in. And don't be frightened to go quite dark, like on some of these spirals. You can almost take it right back into the kind of black section that you've got in. If you've got a black pencil, that will be even more. You can almost disappear right into it. Give it some time, and just getting that nice soft blend between the two. If you've got like a small cotton bud, as opposed to a giant cotton bud, honestly. But yes, if you've got a small cotton bud, you can use that to slightly soften and blend your pencil a bit further into the paper. They're quite effective for sort of giving that really delicate break shading, from dark to light. But we can just sort of see how I just done a little bit there, but that's really starting to make that sort of jump and sort of give it some life. And I quite like that combination of the sort of black and the white kind of, and all that sort of colours together. So for these ones where I've got we've got the sort of banana tree, haven't we, with the sort of hands of bananas and that. I'm going to go over again for a slightly thicker pen, not my full-on brush pen, but a slightly thicker pen. And I'm going to come in and just underneath those bumps, I'm going to put a little line of like extra shadow, just where one is overlapping another one. So where you can see, you get that little triangle of in between the shapes, I'm just going to make that darker. And we're going to help to make that stand out a bit. So as it comes down, where you've got an overlap, that's what you want to colour. Just drawing the line again, but just drawing it heavier. So maybe if you've got a 0.8 pen, something like that, just to add like a little lick of shadow. You can see how that's already just making those details pop out so much more. Again, just by popping those down and round, just underneath. And it's just where the curve hits the one. So if you've got one on top, you just go round it on the one below, really. And it's not very heavy at the moment. We can always add some more shading to it. But just imagine where they're sort of overlapping. You don't have to do the whole thing again. It's not just drawing round it again in the heavier pen. It's just trying to think where it might overlap and just put that little bit of extra shadow in. So at the moment, if you think of the teardrop shape, I'm just kind of going around the bottom of the teardrops each time, because they're casting the shadow on the piece below. So as I come down, I can just add that little lick of shadow, and that's just making it. So you don't have to do every single one, just try and do the bottoms to begin with, because that's, as I said, and it just sort of starts to make them stand out and gives them a slightly sort of 3D kind of feel. And you can do this like as you draw it first off, you know, when you get used to this idea, but I think it's easier, it's more easy to see where you want to go and to control what you're doing, to do them in one sort of level of pen first and then go back and add to them, because as you come down you might want to come in between. Sometimes you see in between the sort of shapes you get like a little triangle kind of appearing, and you can kind of just sort of colour that in. And as you come down the sort of tree shape, you might want to make some of them a bit darker. And you know, so we're getting slightly heavier shadow as we come down. So you can see in between, we're just going to bring that darker. And hopefully we're seeing that starting to make that one stand out. And the kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be perfectly even. It still works just to get that in. So where I've got, as I come down lower, I'm looking for sort of little triangles in between the shapes. I'm going to do more than, I'm just sort of trying to pick out the obvious ones first. And I'm just going to colour those in a bit. So we're getting some darker shadow happening lower down, basically. Because obviously it would be darker the further away from the light you go. And there is something very impenetrable about the light in a pine forest. They can be really quite, even in high summer, they can have that real sense of dark coolness going on because they're so tightly packed. And then as we come down, I'm just going to come in and make some of these shapes go around, some of them in a more heavy way, just to bring that sort of shadow in. I might not do all of them because I want to show you what I'm going to do next on this as well, and I'll have to come back to it in a bit. But where you can see where it's sort of going down, and then again you can get your colour pencil and just come in and add a bit of shade into the tops of each one where they disappear into the ones above, like that. And again you can go quite dark with some of these, because you're going to blend into that heavier, darker line that you've drawn. I'm going to leave, as it were, like the little faces or the sort of fatter ends of the teardrop white, and then build those little bits of shadow in. I'm just trying to get one section done so you can see kind of what we're looking for. It's just leaving that little bit of the round in white so that it sort of becomes like a little pearl. And it starts to give it a sort of 3D kind of feel. I hope that's kind of coming across. And I think you do need the darker pencil, the darker pen line to sort of really blend it into. So I'm just going to put, but you can see sometimes you get the odd little triangle, you can make that dark. And that starts to add more shadow and more, and it's going to make it, give it more kind of 3D quality. Obviously with a lot of these we kind of get some of it, most of it done, or most of it sort of sampled in the session, and then it gives you something to take away and keep going with. Or you might want to, once you've done one, you can kind of go, right, now that I've done it once, I understand more what we're trying to do here, so I can have another go and start bringing my own twist into it, which is what we hope, because the idea is to hopefully inspire you to come up with your own unique creations. And please do share them with me, because I have a lovely learning diary kind of record thing of the lessons that we do together to fill out, and it always cheers them up when I put pictures of your fantastic work in, because it's much more interesting than just we did a drawing of pine trees. I like to be able to share your drawings, and at the beginning of next session it's really nice to share if everyone sends me what they've done, and we can share and see, because even when you're following a similar kind of starting point, it's incredible how everyone interprets it a little bit differently, and particularly if you go away and have a sort of another go on your own, and it's really interesting to see what other students have done. And everyone's work is always so exciting to see. I think even more so when we come to some of the more painterly ones and the sort of fun one, you know, because people can take it in such a different direction. So I'm just doing a little bit of shading, and I hope you're seeing the effect of putting this sort of shadow in, and how it's making that sort of stand out. It's giving it a lot more sort of texture. And also as I come down here, I'm probably going to put a lot more shading in, so we're going to get a bit more tone and shadow. This side I haven't really touched yet, but I don't know if we'll have time to get to all of that. As we've got, so we've already done an hour. It doesn't feel like it, does it? Feels like about 20 minutes, but we have actually done a whole hour already. Right, so I think we can hopefully sort of see where this is coming from. In fact, with the brown, it's quite interesting. Almost looks like a pine cone, which is quite nice. That it's got that sort of feeling. And as you come up, you might want to do a little bit less shading. Just keep it very closely to the ones, just sort of shading where they disappear into each other. Just again to get that sense of light and dark. And I want to start doing in this one here, again, I'm just going to come in along from the central trunk and just shade up into some of the white there, but where they're overlapping, because there's a lot of nice overlapping on this one, I'm going to put a little bit of shadow like coming along, and where they overlap this tree, this is also where I want to put some shadow in, so that it gets quite dark around the edge, and that will help to push this tree back a bit, and to make this one in front kind of comes forward like that. So see, just by adding that little bit of shadow in, that's just going to help pop that forward. See, if I come along that edge there, that's going to start making this side one stand out a lot more. We could go in and make some of this shape in the middle, that could become dark as well, but that's something you can go back to as we go. I just want to get this sort of shading as it comes. So where it's overlap, we're going to shade along the overlap and then down into that centre. And by going down in towards the centre, it's going to give that trunk a bit more definition and weight, you know, give it real sort of power, make it look more like a trunk. So you can hopefully see kind of where I'm going with that one. So that's kind of starting to bring that in. On this one that's behind, I want to get more shadow into this, and I think I'm with this one because I want to get some I want to make sure that these two shapes in front pop out. I think where I've got this circular one, I'm going to come back in and do little spirals into those circles and really make them darker, so they've got a bit more presence. And if I want to make them lighter as they go towards the top, I can just do a more open spiral with less, just go round less, or start you know, like just go in and then not go all the way into the middle, and that'll make it a bit lighter. But I want to get this where it's disappearing down here, I want to get this nice sense of overlapping by getting that a bit darker. Let me come this side. It's so hard, it looks so much crisper in real life, but I'll show you, it's very difficult to get the camera and the lighting to work. So as I come around the edge of this one, these ones on the circles on the side, those are going to get really dark because I want them to stand out So little tiny, and then spirals inside there. And as they come towards the middle a bit more, spiral peters out a bit, is not as strong, just to let a bit more light into it. But we should hopefully start to see lots of nice shadow coming in around this one in front and making it sort of pop forwards. So always that thing, if you want to make something lighter in a drawing, make the things around it darker, because there's a point you can't go lighter then. And then again, so if we make it slightly darker on the side, it's going to stand out a bit more. And we'll get that point nice and dark, so that becomes nice and strong against our kind of winter paper sky. Here we go, and just come down in between those trees and into that gap. And that gap starts to get nice and strong then, and we're really kind of seeing that, oops, sorry, I just knocked the camera there. We're hopefully seeing that coming together and really looking, you can see that popping forward. Same with this one behind, although it's already quite dark. I think just a little tiny flick of pen into each of those tiny shapes. I just want to make that look a bit darker, but I don't want to lose, excuse me, I don't want to lose completely the detail in that design. So I'm just going to almost just put like a little dot, but put my pen on, give it a little flick, just darken up that top so that it's nice and strong as a background for what's going on with this one here. And I'm going to come in between and just do a bit of shadow again, just so those are kind of coming. Right, okay, so that's looking quite good. One thing I want to do, just again to sort of make it, we're going to look at the frame in a second, but I'm going to start adding a little bit of shadow, again, as if I'm shading around and behind these shapes, just to get a little bit of a sepia kind of colour. And you could use all sorts of colours. I said you can use any colour. You could use a sort of wintry blue, would look quite nice. But I just want to bring, so it's almost like drawing a sort of cut out shadow around the edge of the tree, so that they're going to stand out against the background, as if they were slightly cut out from the, and sort of casting a shadow on a background. I just quite like that feel. So where you've got these whiter edges here, you don't have to make all of the tree dark if you come in and colour in around it. And can you see how, as I'm coming in around it, it's helping those white leaves kind of stand out again a bit more. But I'm just following the shapes that I've got. And if you are using a watercolour pencil, you could use a little bit of water just to sort of soften that edge in, just so that it sort of blends in a bit. But we're getting quite this nice sort of cut out old newspaper kind of feel. I don't know why that would be Christmassy, but I don't know, it just seems quite nice. And I can just bring a bit of shading into around that sort of frame there. So let's have a look at the frame, like I said. Now obviously there's more shading to be done in here, and that's going to be a bit more work to come in and, but we've kind of hopefully got a sense of what we can do. All of these patterns, like in this sort of spirally one here, you know, we could come in between some of these spirals and kind of shade them. I'm thinking this one, eventually I'm going to come in, just going to do a few, but look, I'm going to do that centre probably dark like that there. Yeah, just sort of like give that makes it stand out a bit more, doesn't it? Gives it a bit more presence. Dare I make the terrible pun, a bit more Christmas presents. Oh no, had to go there, sorry. Yeah, but that's quite quick, and it just helps to make that's going to stand out a lot more when it's doing that. Right, so the frame, so we've got loads of scope in the frame. I want to try and make it look a little bit like it's a sort of curved picture frame. So to do that, we're going to use curved lines. Sounds obvious, but if we give our lines, so whatever we draw, if we give them, let me just adjust the camera because it's just disappearing off the top there. So we're going to think of them sort of like curving out towards us. So to begin with, just do some very simple shapes like that. But can you see how it's like doing brackets, but they're all curving in the same direction. So that's the kind of curve that we want to get into our frame. So if you then want to come at an angle, you can kind of bring them, and you can make them do a kind of fan by kind of changing direction and bringing that round there. So you can stick just a very simple lines like that, which gives you that kind of feel, any kind of pattern. So if you want to take like a spiral, again, just imagine if you spiral just sort of curling and then disappearing off and round, that's going to help getting that kind of feel. We can do some rainbow shapes coming round like that. But what I want to show you is once you've done some sort of patterns like that, it'd be nice to get some shading into it, and then we can shade it in a way that helps to make our frame look like it's 3D. So again, like I'm doing a triangle here, but instead of using straight lines, I'm doing them slightly curved, and that just again helps to make that look like it's curving around like that. So again, over here on this side, making them curved, it almost starts to look like plaiting, which is quite nice, having all these ones. And if you get more confident, you can obviously do more complicated patterns, but I think even just doing spirals and shapes like that are a kind of really good way of getting that sort of curved feel. But I want to get more of that feeling, so I'm going to go back to my brown pencil. Again, you can use any colour you like. I'm going to stick to the brown pencil so it's all kind of part of it. So if you've got a curved thing like this, what you have to imagine is that where it's curving down towards the frame, it's going to be a little bit darker than on the top of the frame where the curve is sort of sticking up. So to begin with, I'm going to sort of do a little bit of shading all the way along the bottom edge like this, just in the sort of band going along. So at the moment I'm sort of slightly ignoring the patterns that I've done in, but I've just put that little bit of shadow, and that straight away starts to make that look like it's popping out a bit. So I'm going to do a similar kind of bit of shadow along the top here, and that's going to again start to make that look like it's sort of 3D. And then I'm going to imagine that these are kind of a bit stripy, so this one's going to be a darker stripe, so I'm going to leave like a little bit of white on it in the middle section. So with this stripe here, I'm going to do a bit of shading at the bottom and then down from the top. But can you see how I'm deliberately leaving that little patch of white on it? And so the next one's going to be dark. So again, the same sort of thing. And so I'm going to try and imagine it's like a strip of highlight coming across the top. And I'm going to leave a white space, sort of, it doesn't have to line up perfectly, but you see how leaving that across that top, it's starting to make that look like a little bit of shine that's catching on that sort of surface, if it was a silver frame or something. So again, I can, and you always think where you're coming down to the edge, where it's coming down to that drawn line, that's where I can make it darker. So I can come back in and get a bit more darkness again. If you kind of always go with a kind of middle tone, not your lightest, not your darkest to begin with, and then you've got somewhere to go, then you can go darker on it and make it a bit more 3D. I've got a little bit of tone on the white stripes because you would always have a little bit of tone, but can you see how hopefully that's that little section there, that's just starting to look quite 3D, like it's sort of popping out towards you. So again, I've got stripes here, so I start off with the mid-tone, just quite lightly, and then down from the top to meet it, leaving that white section in the middle, in that little triangle as well. And then, so this one will be dark, so again, just that little bit, but all the time trying to imagine there's this bubble of white light that you're capturing along that surface, just to give that, I'm just on that tiny section. You can see that if you were to continue that all the way around, it's going to really make that frame look lovely and three-dimensional. If you want to, you can kind of even think about where your weave is going in and out of the patterns you've done. You can kind of make them look more like they're going in and out by kind of adding some shadow where they're dropping under. But maybe we'll just stick to this one for now, because it's quite, so when you first do it, it can be quite confusing, but then you sort of realise what you're aiming for, and it is just really effective. So let's see how it would work on this spiral section here, where I've got this sort of rainbow, sort of sideways rainbow. So here I've got to imagine that my light is sort of collecting in the middle of this rainbow. So I'm going to do alternate stripes again. So I'll just start off with a bit of dark on the bottom. I'll sort that corner out in a minute. I'm going to come back to it. And so I'm just doing just that little bit first. You can always it's all that thing, you can always add more pencil, it's harder to take it away. So start relatively modestly and you can build it up. So on this side, again, I just want to do this first sort of edge here. So just into that little slope there, not all the way across yet, and that would be that one there. And then maybe just a tiny whisper of colour onto that one here, not too much. And then that triangle there would probably be darker. And then I can sort of like, right, so this one's going to come up here. My highlight would be sort of around about here, and it's going to come back and down there. And this one, if you end up doing, I've just done two that are kind of like side by side, doesn't really matter. You know, the world will forgive us. So I'm going to come down into, and in that one there, that's going to be quite sort of dark. And then I can put a little bit of shadow all the way across that edge again to give that a bit of a kind of 3D feel. So, but this is quite a light shadow because it's going across the white ones as well. And once I've sort of seen that, that's starting to look quite nice and shaded. So I might then increase this side. This may take out a little bit more and make it a bit darker towards that bottom edge. Like that. And then we can just increase that. Because we've just stuck to a mid-tone, we can increase the tonal value near the bottom. We can make it, which just means make it, it's a posh way of saying make it a bit darker. Increase the tonal value, make it a bit darker. Like that, that's it. And then you can exaggerate that a bit, and we're starting to get again that nice sort of, look how 3D that corner looks now. It really looks like it's that you could reach out and sort of bump your finger over it. So it'd be really nice to kind of work your way round and do all of your frame. I'm not going to do too much more because we've sort of established how to do that bit, and I want to make sure we've covered all our bases. Sometimes I quite like, because again I'm trying for this sort of old photo, you can just do a little flick of shade, literally put your pencil on that frame line and then just flick it straight down, and then maybe little flicks up from the tree to meet it, and it kind of starts to have that old photograph kind of feel about it. And I can get a little bit of shadow on in behind those trees again, build up that sort of shadow shape sort of in there, but that's just a nice way of sort of giving that sort of slight surface texture. So I'm going to come back and look at some of the trees now, make sure that we've covered all the kind of ideas that we might have on there. Let's come back a bit. Yeah, that frame looks really effective, doesn't it? I'm pleased with that. I think it's all starting to look quite, you know, so it has got this sort of mysterious old photo feel. I don't know why that's Christmassy, not really, but you know, I just like it. So again, coming down around here, where this is touching this tree here, just make sure I'm going to come round and go around some of these sort of bump shapes and just get a bit more shadow. So when they come down to meet that tree, I want to get some darkness down this bottom area here because I want to get some weight into it. When I'm talking about weight, I'm talking about sort of extra darkness because it's heavier in feel. And so generally speaking, because of gravity, things that are heavier tend to be down the bottom. So we tend to get more shadow, and obviously you can see with the cone, with the tree shape, we get more foliage at the bottom. It's like a foundation, isn't it? You wouldn't have a top, you don't often have a top heavy pine tree. Even if you've got a tree with a spreading canopy, you know that it's got twice as much going on underground to balance it out. So visually, if you can get more weight and sort of darkness into the bottom of a picture, it just makes more sense. It kind of roots it rather than making it look like the other way up. It tends to make it look top heavy and makes it look like it's a bit floaty. So I'm just going to go around these shapes again with my slightly thicker pen. I've recently discovered using calligraphy pens. They sell like fibre tip pens for calligraphy, but they're actually really useful for drawing because all the nibs, no matter what size they are slightly flexible because they're designed to flex with the pressure of the hand. And you can get some really lovely, this is a calligraphy pen that I'm using now, and you can get some really lovely effects because you can just really gently push harder when you want to sort of increase your line, and then lighter when you want a thinner line. I find them very flexible and responsive, which is quite good. I'm working on a project at the moment where I'm having to draw lots of Chinese houses. And I'm working with other illustrators, all of whom are half my age, and are all horrified that I only really draw with pen on paper, and I don't tend to draw on iPads and things like that. I use iPads, I use Procreate, I use them for colouring. So what I tend to do is do the drawing on paper and then scan it and then colour it in digitally. But I cannot draw with digital, and they were laughing at me the other day, and I sort of said, well, I just can't do it. And it's because there's no difference with digital. When you're drawing, if you've ever tried drawing on a screen with a digital pencil, everything feels the same. It's just a same amount of slide, so there's no grit. So, you can on the screen be drawing with something that looks like a sort of big fat bit of charcoal, but you're still holding a very slender pen in your hand, and it's sort of slipping on a slidey surface. And it just doesn't work for me. I just can't. I need that sort of grit on the paper and that the sort of different surfaces to understand the line that I'm making. And they all were suitably impressed with my drawing. So I was like, you should try it, kids. I was saying, try and have some real drawing in your time. But I just think it's really interesting how, and they all can't draw on paper. They can draw on paper, but they always go for digital. I think it's also because with digital, every time you make a mistake, you can just make it vanish instantaneously. And sometimes I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because sometimes, it's part of the thought process as an artist is working out where to go when things go wrong. Can sometimes when something goes wrong and you spill something or it doesn't come out the way you hoped, you discover something else that you weren't expecting. And weirdly, I think that doesn't happen so much with digital. I'm not in any way against it. I'm not an old dinosaur going, bah humbug, all this modern stuff. But and the other thing I found that because I tend to draw a lot when I'm going on train journeys, which is difficult enough on pen and paper, but trust me, it's impossible on digital because every single milli movement of the train just sends your pen skidding about on the surface. So if, like me, you have 8 million things to do all the time, you look forward to a long train journey as a moment of respite and peace when you can do something for yourself. It's very disappointing to find you've bought your digital pad and it doesn't work on a train because it's sliding about too much. I might be speaking from bitter experience at this point, but so I'm just going through and just picking out, just refining some of those sort of dark shapes. I might just try this as an experiment. I'm going to try just refining, like increasing the depth on some of those edges as we come up, just to kind of give that sort of slightly more shadowed effect into that sort of shading. So I've got the brown paper shading and brown pencil shading, got brown paper on the brain, and that I think just now the dark against that, I think that looks really nice just to make that start to stand out and sort of pop out. And I think it does have that slightly cut out of paper kind of feel, which is really nice. How are we doing? Oh, we've got a whole 9 minutes left. Gosh, right, okay. So I'm just going to come around again these shapes and just kind of make them stand out a little bit against their background. And of course, if you really enjoy collage and you've got a whiz with a scalpel, I think there's something really attractive about cut-out shapes, and we are going to be doing, but a much simpler cut-out, I should point out, than this in a couple of weeks' time. But you could cut all these out and then put them onto a backdrop, and and again, I'm going back to my moans about digital, but you can get all sorts of apps that make things look like this, but there's nothing compares to beautiful paper cutting. And that's collage, in my opinion. So I'm just going to make this dark one a bit heavier and just use some of that shadow line just to come in and add a bit more depth to it. But I'm hoping that we're starting to get this feel. I don't know why I've got this idea in my head, but it's the idea of like someone making a sort of cut out winter scene, out of interesting papers. And that's kind of, I'm sort of trying to get the drawing to feel a bit like that, like they're sort of popping out of a background, sort of layered out like that. And I can just come around here. I want to make them sort of dark, so we're definitely seeing them strong and striking against that kind of background. And I definitely need to put something in here. I've missed a space there. Well, I think we just need to get another tree in there, really. But I will leave that to your imagination as to what tree you're going to put into that space. Or you might just grow another one sideways. Yours might have gone a bit bigger, so you might not have a space there. But yeah, just adding that sort of dark, I think just adding that darker outline is starting to make them stand out. Let's put it onto this one as well. And I think, you know, maybe I'm thinking strange paper collages, maybe it's sort of like reaching back into dim, distant childhood when we didn't have, you know, 8 million things in the shops, and we used to make Christmas decorations out of paper and stuff every year, and, you know, gingerbread angels and all that sort of thing, and paper chains. And I genuinely do remember, I wasn't actually alive during the war, I should point out, but I do remember making paper chains out of newspaper, and how everyone wanted to get the Financial Times because it was a nice colour. You know, and old wrapping paper into paper chains and things like that. And it was actually jolly good fun. But there we go. So, you know, I reckon I could set up a stall somewhere swanky and sell paper chains made of old magazines, and they'd probably be quite sought after now, wouldn't they? People would buy them from, you know, an ironic point of view, and I could sell them for lots of money. But here we go. I could call them recycled, couldn't I? Carbon neutral, they'd be. It's like, you know, when you sort of, you know, see products labelled, oh, gluten-free, and you go, well, that's rice, that's always been gluten-free, you know, you haven't done anything special to it. So again, I'm just going to increase the outline around some of these shapes so they're starting to stand out in a kind of nice crisp fashion all the way along, just to give them a bit more boldness and sort of heft. And so we're sort of getting really close. Now, can we use some of these darker shadows on the frame? Let's have a look. Let's just try that. I'm just going to very quickly colour this shape in. So we've nearly got all the way across the card, or the shape, and I might put a bit more. If I had more time, I'd probably get some a nice yellowy pencil or a sandy colour. What I was really looking for was a sort of sandy colour as well, so I could get another tone into that. I've got a sort of peachy one, but it's not quite the right colour, but I'm just thinking just to add in a little bit into the background, just maybe blending those to get this sort of old newspaper colour. And, you know, blending that in. I don't know if this will come out on the camera because it's quite subtle, but a little bit of sort of yellowness into that background, just to give it this sort of old world kind of feel. You can just about see it, and it's quite, I think it'll look quite subtle when you see it. And then I think, just thinking about the frame, I think we can add a tiny bit like of extra dark shadow, maybe just along. And this is why this pen is really I'm enjoying this pen so much, because again I can just put a little bit of pressure on it and just get that slightly darker, thicker line going along the top, just on the where it's meeting the picture, because that's where it's going to cast a little bit of shadow down onto our kind of work of art. And I really like it. It's really lovely to be able to get this effect where if you look at just that sort of corner there, it's really popping out and looking very 3D, and it almost looks like you can sort of pick it up, and these are starting to stand out against the background, and that's the whole kind of slightly strange, slightly surreal effect I was going for, I think. So I'm quite happy with the way that's turning out. Again, it's just going to be crisping up, adding some shadow to some of these lines and moving that round. And then this is our strange forest of doodle trees. And I sort of feel, looking at this, that I want to put a moon somewhere up here. It just seems to be crying out for a moon, doesn't it? So you can obviously use a compass to draw your circle. Luckily, I happen to have one of these stencil-y things. You can usually pick these up really cheaply. That's a bit of a small circle. Let me find a bigger circle. From online retailers, and even the sort of like kids section, they often have them in sort of the works and stuff, you know, with all the sort of, I still can't find one that's quite the right size, however I haven't said that, but you know, I know where my circle one is, and it's in another room, and I can hear it laughing at me as I can't get to it, but I'm going to put it in, maybe I think a moon. But yeah, these are always quite good to invest in, because, you know, they're quite good fun to use. Maybe up there, maybe over this side. I think over this side, because we've, let's find a bit, there we go, there we go. So that's either a moon or it's a sun, and somehow that sort of really helps to get the picture into perspective and sort of give it that sort of, and if it's going to be a moon, I'm not going to go for a very black sky, but I can just put a little bit of the brownness around, as if it's the moon that time, like one of those days when, you know, the sky is really cold and you see the moon and the sun out at the same time, which is always a quite, you know, it's always something weirdly magical about seeing a bit of moon in the daytime. But I can just then drop the shadow a little bit round it, and that's going to start to pop out a bit. If you wanted it the other way around, you could turn it into a lovely red setting sun when you get those fantastic skies in the autumn and winter. And we're nearly going to have to stop there, but I'm just going to say what you could do, because I have got a water soluble pencil or a watercolour pencil. If you had a brush to hand, please don't have a brush to hand. I normally do, except when I need one. Here's one. Right, so a little bit of water on the watercolour pencil, and I can now blend that bit of brown watercolour up into the sky a bit, just to kind of smooth that off a bit. Some of the pens may not be 100% waterproof, but sometimes you can get some lovely effects when they aren't. You can sort of get them to blend and sort of create a little bit of shadow. But so I'm just going to I said I wasn't going to use watercolour tonight, and I'm naughty. I've now used a bit of watercolour. Well, there we go. It's just sort of softening that colour. You can see how just by blending that colour into the background, it's really making these drawn shapes pop out in contrast to it. And it's got that lovely kind of quality. And even though it's all brown, and you don't often get a brown sky unless you've got a severe pollution problem, it still just starts to make that look more like a sort of moon against the sky. And I think it's getting to be really quite an attractive image. You know, it's something that looks, although it's very doodly and very abstract, I think it's got a lovely wintry kind of feel to it. So I'm just using that to blend those colours in together. I wonder if is that going to run? No, that one doesn't run, because one of them's running. It's quite attractive. I was kind of hoping it would. Yeah, sometimes you get some lovely effects, so you can just sort of get the pen line to sort of fuzz out a little bit. And then again, if you want to, you can come in to the shading on the where you've done it in pencil, and you can turn that into a paint line. If you haven't used watercolour paints and you've just used ordinary pencils, again, try smudging it with, if you can't find a cotton bud, sometimes like you can get these sort of smudge sticks things that are like really tightly rolled pieces of paper, and they work really nicely to really soften and sort of blend those colours in. But there we go. So not 100% finished, but we don't often get things 100% finished. I feel you're not getting your money's worth if you don't have something to keep you going till I see you next week. So there we go. So that's our kind of monochrome, almost sepia cut out winter tree doodle, which is a very long title. I need to refine that a bit, but there we go. I will just let us all come back together if I can stop my video, and